Tasha sat on the edge of her bed, holding the eviction notice in her hands. She had read the letter 3 times already, but the words still didn't make sense. It felt like everything she had worked for was being taken away from her. The letter was from her landlord, Mr. Thompson, a man she had known for years. He owned the building where she lived with her young daughter, Layla. They had lived there for 5 years. 5 years of struggling, working hard, paying bills on time, and trying to make the best life they could. But now, out of nowhere, she was being asked to leave. The letter explained that the building was being sold to a new investor who wanted to renovate the apartments. Tasha read the words over and over, trying to understand. It didn't matter that she had been a good tenant. Mr. Thompson didn't care. The letter said that Tasha and other tenants needed to move out so the new owners could make upgrades. The notice felt like a punch in the stomach. She was upset, but she didn't want to let her daughter see her fall apart. Layla was playing in the other room, completely unaware of what was happening. Tasha wiped away a tear and promised herself she would find a way to fix this. Days passed, and Tasha did everything she could to fight the eviction. She called lawyers, went to community meetings, and even reached out to her neighbors who had lived in the building for years. But the law was clear. Mr. Thompson had the right to sell the property and raise the rent. There was nothing she could do to stop it. Tasha even decided to go talk to Mr. Thompson directly. She hoped he might change his mind if he saw how hard she had worked to make this place a home. When she arrived at his office, he greeted her with a professional smile. "I'm sorry, Tasha," Mr. Thompson said, his tone cold but polite. "There's nothing I can do. The building is being sold, and the new investors are planning to fix it up. You'll have to vacate by the end of the month." Tasha felt a wave of anger. "But I've been here for 5 years," she said, trying to stay calm. "I've paid my rent on time every month. I've been a good tenant." Mr. Thompson didn't seem to care. He just repeated that the decision was final and that the sale had already been arranged. His words were cold. He didn't even see her as a person. He wasn't concerned about her struggles or her daughter's future. It was just business to him. Tasha left the office feeling defeated. She couldn't understand how someone could be so heartless. It felt like the world was against her, and all she wanted was a stable place for her daughter to grow up. But Tasha didn't give up. She knew she couldn't just accept this. The situation was unfair, and she wasn't going to let it destroy her. She decided to fight back in any way she could. She started doing research, trying to find a way to stay in her apartment. She spoke to her lawyer and learned more about the sale of the building. It was a long shot, but Tasha started to think, what if she could buy the building herself? It seemed impossible, but Tasha wasn't ready to give up. She began reaching out to community organizations that helped people in situations like hers. She learned about potential funding options, and soon, she had enough resources to start the process of buying the building. Tasha knew she didn't have much time, and she was running out of options. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. If she could somehow buy the building, she could save her home and ensure her daughter would grow up in the place she had built. As Tasha worked tirelessly to get everything in place, the pressure built. The days ticked by, and the auction to sell the property was getting closer. She was going up against big investors with deep pockets, but Tasha was determined to fight for what she had. The day of the auction arrived. Tasha walked into the room, feeling nervous but ready. She knew the competition would be tough, and she could feel the eyes of the other bidders on her. She was the underdog in this fight, but she wasn't going to back down. Mr. Thompson stood at the front, quietly watching as the bids started to rise. Tasha could see his smug face, and she could tell that he thought the property was already sold. But Tasha wasn't going to let that happen. She raised her paddle, determined to hold on to the home she and her daughter had worked so hard for. As the auction went on, the bids kept climbing. But Tasha held her ground. She knew this was her only chance. With one final bold move, Tasha made the winning bid. The room went silent. She had won. The other bidders stared in disbelief. Mr. Thompson was stunned. He had thought the property would be sold to one of the wealthy investors, but instead, it was now in the hands of the woman he had evicted. Tasha smiled to herself as she walked out of the auction room. She couldn't believe it. She had done it. She had bought the building back for herself and her daughter. But even as Tasha stood victorious, she knew this wasn't the end. Mr. Thompson was angry, and she had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. He wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily, and Tasha wasn't sure if he would ever accept defeat. Tasha couldn't believe it. She had only a few days left before she had to vacate her apartment. The clock was ticking, and it felt like everything she had worked so hard for was slipping through her fingers. But Tasha wasn't ready to give up just yet. She had always been a fighter, and she wasn't about to back down now. She packed up the boxes in her living room, feeling the weight of the eviction notice she had received. Layla was playing with her dolls in the corner, completely unaware of how their lives were about to change. Tasha tried her best to hide her frustration, but every time she glanced at her daughter, she felt a pang of guilt. She had promised Layla a better life, and now everything seemed uncertain. Tasha had hoped that something could be done to stop the eviction, but the legal system didn't seem to care. Her lawyer explained that because the building was sold to a new investor, there was nothing they could do. The law favored the landlord in these situations. The eviction was legal, and there was no way around it. "I'm sorry, Tasha," her lawyer had said. "Unfortunately, the sale of the building means that the new owners have the right to raise the rent and make changes. The law is on their side. It wasn't fair. Tasha had done everything right. She paid her rent on time, kept the apartment clean, and raised her daughter the best she could. But none of that mattered. The truth was, gentrification was happening all around her. Families who had lived in the neighborhood for years were being forced out to make room for wealthier tenants. Tasha was just one of many victims of this growing trend. Frustrated and angry, Tasha went to see Mr. Thompson again. She wasn't going to let him get away with this without at least trying to reason with him. She walked up to his office, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. Mr. Thompson greeted her with his usual smile, but there was something cold about it this time. "What can I do for you, Tasha?" he asked, as though the eviction notice was just another routine business transaction. "I'm not asking for special treatment, Mr. Thompson," Tasha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just want to stay here. This is my home. I've been a good tenant for 5 years. Please reconsider." Mr. Thompson sighed. He sat down behind his desk and folded his hands. "I understand that this is tough for you," he said, his voice flat. "But the building is being sold. The new owners want to renovate, and there's nothing I can do. It's out of my hands now." Tasha felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. It was just business to him. He didn't care about the families being forced out or the struggles they were facing. To him, it was just another transaction, another way to make money. He had no understanding of what it meant to be a single mother trying to make ends meet. "I'm not asking for a favor," Tasha said, her voice breaking. "I'm asking for fairness. This isn't right. I have a child. We've been here for years. You're just kicking us out without a second thought." Mr. Thompson's expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, but the decision is final," he said. "You'll have to be out by the end of the month. I can't do anything to help." Tasha's heart sank. She had been hoping for some understanding, some compassion, but she had found none. She stood up to leave, feeling defeated. There was no way out. Back at her apartment, Tasha tried to keep it together for Layla. She didn't want her daughter to see how upset she was. She tried to smile as they packed up the last of their belongings, but it was hard. The reality of the situation was too much. They had to leave, and there was no place for them to go. Tasha looked through her phone, searching for any apartments or homes she could afford. But the rental prices in the area were outrageous. Gentrification had made it impossible for people like her to live comfortably in their own neighborhoods. The places she could afford were far from ideal, and many were in areas that didn't feel safe. Her options were limited. She had no family to turn to, no backup plan. She couldn't afford to stay in a hotel, and she didn't want to uproot Layla's life even more than it already had been. She tried to put on a brave face, but deep down, she felt hopeless. Tasha spent the next few days trying to make sense of everything. She had been forced to move out of her home with nowhere to go, and the legal system seemed designed to help people like Mr. Thompson, not people like her. But just as she was starting to feel completely defeated, a small glimmer of hope appeared. She got a call from a community organization that helped families facing eviction. The organization offered legal aid and advice on how to fight gentrification. Tasha learned that there were ways to challenge evictions in some cases, especially when there was evidence of wrongdoing or discrimination. The community group also told Tasha about a program that could help her buy the building. It wasn't easy, and the odds were against her, but there was a chance, a small chance, that she could fight back. Tasha didn't have much, but now she had something to hold on to, a chance to take control of the situation. Tasha's life had turned upside down. The eviction was official, and she was left with no choice but to pack up her things. The apartment that she had called home for so many years was now just a place she used to live. She couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. It felt like everything was slipping away. She spent the next few days trying to find somewhere else to stay, but as she searched through listings and called different landlords, she realized something. The rents were sky high. It was impossible to find a place that she could afford. And the places that were cheaper weren't in safe neighborhoods. She didn't want to raise her daughter, Layla, in a place that made her feel unsafe. Layla asked her questions that broke Tasha's heart. "Mom, why do we have to move?" she asked, her eyes wide with confusion. Tasha tried to explain as best as she could, but how could she explain to her daughter that they were being forced out because of money? "I know, baby, I know," Tasha said softly. "We'll figure it out, I promise." But every night, as Tasha lay in bed, she wondered how much longer she could keep this promise. She had nowhere else to turn. She had always worked hard to make ends meet, but now it felt like the world was against her. One evening, as she scrolled through her phone, she stumbled across a news article about the building being sold. The article mentioned that the new owners were planning to renovate the apartments and raise the rent. But there was one line that caught her attention. "The building is being auctioned next week." Tasha paused. The building was being auctioned? That was her chance. Maybe, just maybe, she could buy the building back. She didn't have much money, but she had a fire inside her that told her she couldn't give up. She started doing research. She spoke to people who had gone through similar situations, and she reached out to a local community organization that helped people buy homes. The group explained that they helped first-time buyers, like her, find funding and connect with investors. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. Tasha worked day and night, trying to gather the resources she would need to buy the building. She put together a budget, got advice on how to approach the auction, and contacted everyone she knew who might be able to help. The process was exhausting, But every time she felt like giving up, she thought about her daughter. She thought about the life she wanted to give Layla, a life where they didn't have to worry about being pushed out every time the rent went up. She had to fight for it. Tasha even began setting up a crowdfunding campaign, hoping that her story might inspire others to help. She shared her story on social media, telling people about the eviction, her struggle to find a place to live, and her dream of buying the building back. She didn't know if it would work, but she had to try. The days leading up to the auction were filled with stress and uncertainty, but the more Tasha worked, the more she realized she wasn't alone. Others in the community began to rally behind her, supporting her in any way they could. Some people shared her crowdfunding page, while others offered advice or sent messages of encouragement. The community had begun to stand together, and Tasha could feel the power of their support. The day before the auction, Tasha sat down with her lawyer to review the details. She had done everything she could, but it was still a gamble. The other bidders would likely have deep pockets, investors who saw the building as nothing more than a business opportunity. But Tasha wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her home, for her daughter, and for everyone who had been pushed aside by the changes in their neighborhood. "I can't promise you that you'll win tomorrow," her lawyer said, looking at her with concern. "But I can promise you that we'll give it our best shot." Tasha nodded. She had no choice but to go forward. Tomorrow would decide everything. As the evening arrived, Tasha sat down in front of her laptop, reading through all the auction details one last time. She tried to relax, but the tension in her body wouldn't let her. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and thought about everything that had led her to this point. She thought about her daughter, the struggle she had been through, and the community that had supported her. She thought about what it would mean to win this auction and take control of her life. No matter what happened tomorrow, Tasha knew she had done everything she could. She had fought for what was right. The day of the auction had finally arrived. Tasha's heart was racing. It felt like everything she had worked for, everything she had fought through, was about to come down to this one moment. She had done all she could, raised money, contacted people for support, and even convinced a community organization to back her. But now, it was time to see if it would pay off. She woke up early, getting ready for the auction. Layla was still asleep, and Tasha didn't want to worry her. As Tasha pulled on her jacket and walked out the door, she felt a mixture of nerves and determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her daughter, for everyone who had been unfairly pushed out, and for the community that had rallied behind her. She arrived at the auction house a little early. The place was buzzing with activity. Investors and real estate professionals filled the room, each of them eager to get their hands on the building. Tasha stood out. She wasn't an investor. She wasn't wealthy. She was just a single mom who wanted her home back. As the auction began, Tasha could feel the tension in the air. She was outmatched by the other bidders. Some of them had deep pockets, while she was doing everything she could to scrape together the money she had raised. She had to keep reminding herself that she had a chance, but the odds were against her. The bidding started, and it quickly became clear that this would be no easy fight. The first few bids went up in large increments, with several investors trying to outbid each other. Tasha's hands trembled, but she kept her eyes fixed on the auctioneer, waiting for her turn. At first, she hesitated. The bids were climbing higher than she had expected. She didn't know if she could keep up, but then she remembered why she was doing this. For Layla, for the life she wanted to give her. She wasn't going to let someone else take her home. Tasha raised her paddle. She felt the eyes of the room on her, but she didn't care. This was her chance, and she was going to take it. The auctioneer looked at her and nodded. The other bidders started to take notice. Some of them seemed a little surprised to see a woman like her entering the bidding war. But Tasha didn't care. She was here to fight for her home, and she wasn't about to back down now. With each new bid, the price went higher. Tasha's heart pounded as she stayed in the fight. But it wasn't just about the money. This was about proving that she belonged here, that she had the right to stay in the community she had called home for so long. Minutes passed like hours. The auctioneer called out new bids, and the room seemed to hold its breath with every one. Tasha kept her eyes focused, raising her paddle each time a new bid was made. The other investors were starting to look frustrated. They thought they had the advantage, but Tasha wasn't giving up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it was her turn. The price had climbed high, and there were only a few investors left. Tasha took a deep breath and raised her paddle one more time. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the room. "Sold," he declared. Tasha felt a rush of emotion. She had done it. She had bought the building. It was hers again. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, people began to murmur. They couldn't believe it. Tasha had outbid everyone. The other investors looked stunned, and Mr. Thompson, standing in the back of the room, had a look of disbelief on his face. Tasha stood tall, her heart racing. She had won. She had reclaimed her home. But as she looked at Mr. Thompson, she couldn't help but feel a bit of triumph. He had tried to force her out, but she had come back stronger than ever. The victory wasn't just hers. It was for everyone who had ever been pushed aside because they didn't have the money or power. She had shown them all that you don't have to give up. As Tasha left the auction house, she felt like she had won a major battle. She had done the impossible, and now the building was hers again. Her mind raced with the possibilities. She could finally move back into her apartment, the one that she and Layla had been forced to leave. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start. But even with this victory, Tasha knew there was more to be done. She couldn't let Mr. Thompson's actions go unchallenged. He had tried to push her out, but Tasha wasn't just going to walk away and let it happen to others. She would continue fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone in the community who had been affected by gentrification. As she made her way home, Tasha pulled out her phone and texted Layla. "We did it," she typed. "We're going back home." Layla's reply came almost immediately. "I can't wait to go back home." Tasha smiled. It wasn't just her victory. It was their victory. And she knew this was only the beginning. She had taken back what was rightfully hers, and now she was going to make sure no one else would have to face what she did. The day of the auction had arrived. Tasha stood outside the auction house, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had done everything she could to prepare for this moment. Now, it was out of her hands. The future of her home, her community, and her family's future would be decided here today. Tasha walked into the room, her eyes scanning the crowded space. Investors, businessmen, and real estate agents filled the room, all eagerly waiting to bid on the building. The air was thick with tension. This wasn't just an auction to them, it was another opportunity to make money, another investment. But to Tasha, this was much more than that. This was her chance to take back what was taken from her. It wasn't just about buying a property. It was about fighting for her home, her family, and her place in the community. Tasha had worked hard for everything she had, and she wasn't going to let a wealthy investor take it away without a fight. She took a deep breath and sat down, feeling the eyes of the room on her. The auctioneer called the room to order, and the bidding began. The first few bids came in quickly, large sums of money, each bid raising the price higher. Tasha's hands trembled as she gripped her paddle. She knew she couldn't compete with the investors, but she had no choice. She had to try. As the bids climbed higher, Tasha felt a pang of doubt. She knew the investors had deep pockets, and they could easily outbid her. But she couldn't back down. Not now. The auctioneer called out a new bid, and the room fell silent. It was her turn. Tasha raised her paddle, her heart pounding in her chest. The auctioneer nodded, and the bidding war continued. Tasha held firm, matching every bid, pushing the price higher and higher. The other investors looked at her with surprise. A single mom like her, competing with some of the wealthiest people in the room. But Tasha wasn't backing down. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been pushed out of their homes. For her daughter. As the bidding dragged on, the price reached an all-time high. The investors started to grow frustrated. They had underestimated Tasha's determination. Tasha could see the tension on their faces. They hadn't expected a woman like her to challenge them, but she wasn't going to give up. Finally, it came down to just two bidders, Tasha and a wealthy businessman in the front row. The auctioneer raised the hammer again. The businessman made his final bid, a sum so large that many in the room gasped. Tasha hesitated for a moment. The price was steep, but this was her only chance. She had no backup plan, no other option. Tasha took a deep breath and raised her paddle one last time. The room went silent as the auctioneer called her bid. "Sold!" he shouted. Tasha had won. The businessman looked shocked, his face turning red with frustration. The room erupted into murmurs, surprised that a single mother had outbid some of the wealthiest men in the room. Tasha felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had won back her home. As the auctioneer announced the final price and handed over the contract, Tasha couldn't help but smile. She had done what no one expected. She had taken control of her own future. She had shown everyone in that room that it wasn't just about money. It was about heart, about fighting for what you believed in, about standing up against the system that tried to push people like her out. Tasha looked over at Mr. Thompson, who had been watching the entire time. His face was filled with disbelief. He had thought he was going to sell the building to one of the investors. He had thought it was over for Tasha. But now, the tables had turned. The building was hers. Tasha walked out of the auction house, the contract in her hand. It felt like a dream, but it was real. She had won. The apartment building was hers again. She couldn't wait to tell Layla. Tasha knew that this victory was more than just about owning property. It was about proving that you don't have to be rich or powerful to make a difference. She called Layla as she walked to her car. "We did it, baby," Tasha said, her voice filled with emotion. "We're going home." Layla's voice came through the phone, full of excitement. "Really, Mom? We're going back home?" "Yes," Tasha said with a smile. "We're going back home. And this time, it's our home." As Tasha sat in her car, staring out at the city, she realized that this wasn't just a win for her. It was a win for everyone. She had fought back against a system that wanted to push her and others like her out, and she had won. This wasn't just about buying a building. This was about resilience, about standing up for what's right, and about proving that one person can make a difference. Tasha sat in her car, holding the contract in her hands. She couldn't believe it. The building was hers. The fight was over. At least she thought it was. But even as she sat there, her mind raced with the uncertainty of what might come next. Mr. Thompson and the investors hadn't expected her to win. They thought she was just a mother, struggling to get by, someone they could easily push out of the equation. But now, the tables had turned, and Tasha had secured her victory. When she walked back into the building later that day, she couldn't stop smiling. This place, which had once felt like it was slipping from her grasp, was now hers again. As she walked down the familiar hallways, she thought about how much she had gone through to get here. It had been a struggle every step of the way, but the strength of her love for Layla had carried her through. They had done it together. But even as she stood in her new office, the realization hit her. Winning the auction was just the beginning. There were still so many challenges ahead. Tasha knew she would have to make changes. The building needed repairs, and some of the tenants would need help transitioning as well. This was no longer just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been pushed out by gentrification. A few days after the auction, Tasha received a surprising phone call from Mr. Thompson. She had expected him to be upset, but this was something else. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he told her, "You've won, Tasha. But don't think this is over. I'll be watching you." The words made Tasha's stomach churn. Was this some kind of threat? She couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, but she refused to let fear take over. She had won, and no one could take that away from her. But the call made her realize that the battle was far from over. There would be more hurdles ahead, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. Tasha's first task was to meet with the other tenants. She knew some of them might be worried. After all, they had seen what had happened before, how quickly things could change in their neighborhood. Some of them had probably felt the same fear she had when she received the eviction notice. She held a meeting in the building's main lobby, inviting all the tenants to come and hear what she had to say. As they trickled in, Tasha noticed the mix of confusion, hope, and fear on their faces. They didn't know what to expect from her. They had seen landlords come and go, and they had seen how people like Mr. Thompson used their power to force people out. "Listen," Tasha said, standing in front of the group. "I know this has been a difficult time for all of you. I want you to know that I'm not just here to fix up this building and raise rent. I'm here to make sure everyone has a place to stay, and no one is forced out because of gentrification. You won't be treated like numbers here. You're all part of this community, and I plan to keep it that way." Her words were met with a mix of relief and skepticism. Some of the tenants seemed to breathe a little easier, but others weren't so sure. They had been burned before by promises that never came true. Tasha knew she had to earn their trust, and that would take time. But she was willing to do whatever it took. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for Tasha. She worked tirelessly with contractors to make the necessary repairs to the building. She spent hours talking to tenants, making sure they were comfortable with the changes and getting to know each of them personally. Slowly but surely, the building started to feel like a home again, a place where people mattered, not just a property to make money off of. But even as Tasha worked to make things right, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite finished. Mr. Thompson had been quiet, too quiet. She knew he was angry, and she had a feeling he wasn't done yet. A week later, Tasha received another call. This time, it was from a lawyer representing Mr. Thompson. The lawyer told her that Mr. Thompson was challenging the sale in court, claiming that the auction had been fraudulent, and that Tasha's bid was too low. Tasha was stunned. She had won fairly, and now this man was trying to take it all back. The news hit Tasha like a punch to the gut. She had fought so hard to get to this point, and now it seemed like the fight wasn't over. But Tasha wasn't afraid. She had come this far, and she was not going to back down now. She called her lawyer, determined to fight this in court. The court battle was long and difficult. Mr. Thompson's lawyer threw everything they could at her, but Tasha had the community behind her, and that made all the difference. People from the neighborhood came forward to testify, speaking about how they had seen Mr. Thompson's treatment of tenants and the impact of his actions on the community. They spoke about how Tasha had already made improvements in the building and had shown real commitment to the tenants. In the end, the judge ruled in Tasha's favor. The sale was upheld, and Tasha remained the rightful owner of the building. Tasha couldn't help but smile as she walked out of the courtroom. She had done it. She had fought back against a system that wanted to push her and her community out, and she had won. It had been a long and difficult journey, but she had proven that one person can make a difference. As Tasha walked back into the building, she looked around at the people who had supported her. The community was stronger than ever, and it was clear that, together, they could overcome anything. Tasha smiled as she looked out over the neighborhood. This was her home, and she was determined to make sure it stayed that way. No more would people like Mr. Thompson be able to come in and take what wasn't theirs. She'd fought for her home, and she was ready to keep fighting for the future. If you were inspired by Tasha's journey and her fight for what's right, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this video to inspire others, and leave a comment telling us how you'd stand up for what's yours. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to stay updated on more incredible stories like this. Thanks for watching.